This evildoer will be replaced by another evildoer, and our war against Hamas will continue. Israelis want to see that the Israeli government can do for our hostages what the American government did for its hostage. Consider the fact that President Trump came to the region but did not visit the state of Israel. The Israeli Air Force launched a series of significant strikes against an underground stronghold that was situated in close proximity to the European hospital in the southern city of Khan Yunis. And as with any strike on any structure close to a hospital, the target was a very high value target. And in this case, it was none other than Mohammed Sinwar. And if confirmed, his death will constitute the elimination of one of the most notorious terror operatives on the face of the earth and one of the leading members of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. And he has a very long history of terrorism against the people and the state of Israel that predates the October 7th massacre. And he also has a considerable history of abductions of Israelis that led to wars, incidentally, which immiserated the Gazan people as a result of his actions. Wars that cost the lives of Gazan citizens, about whom Sinwar, his brother Yahya Sinwar, and all of the Hamas leadership could not care a jot. Sinwar is a former commander of Hamas's Khan Yunis brigade, and he has steadily climbed the chain of command as a result of Israel's targeted assassinations of Hamas's leadership. In July, Israel eliminated the previous head of Hamas's military wing, Mohammed Def, a role that was swiftly assumed by Mohammed Sinwar. He then became the chief commander of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip after his brother Yahya Sinwar was eliminated by the IDF in October of last year. Now, while this does throw Hamas's command and control structure into further disarray, it is very unlikely to impact the ongoing hostage negotiations, in my assessment, because those are largely being conducted via Hamas's political leadership, which resides outside of the Gaza Strip. People should also keep in mind that while these targeted killings certainly constitute important gains and achievements for the IDF at the highest tactical level, for the members of the Israeli Defense Forces who are serving on the ground fighting in this war, the elimination of Mohammed Sinwar will have little immediate impact indeed. I remember, for example, exactly where I was when word came in that Yahya Sinwar, his older brother, had been eliminated back in October of last year. During that time, I was inside the Gaza Strip with my reserve unit. Reports started to come in over the radio that he had been taken out, and due to the situation at hand, we did not have access to our cell phones, but when we returned to the base, we all took to those phones and we saw the photographs of Yahya Sinwar's corpse. And I was in a very, very similar situation when the former terror mastermind and criminal Hassan Nasrallah was eliminated by way of Israeli airstrikes inside Lebanon. In both of those cases, I and the soldiers alongside whom I serve took to our phones, assessed the reports, received confirmation that both terror heads were in fact dead, and then, without any ceremony and without even the most minor of changes to our mission set, we all climbed back into our vehicles and we rolled out to undertake our duties as set out by our commanders. And I mention that so that people understand that while this news is of very, very high significance to the observer, to the members of the IDF in the field, this event actually makes very little difference indeed. This evildoer will be replaced by another evildoer, and our war against Hamas will continue until they're defeated or our government declares otherwise. As unpalatable as this may sound to some, the IDF's readiness to operate in and around hospitals inside the Gaza Strip constitutes a very welcome change in the policy of Israel's leadership, because for far too long, Hamas has cynically hijacked any and all facilities inside the Gaza Strip. from private residences to United Nations schools to mosques to hospitals. And Hamas has utilized those facilities in order to prepare for terror activities and to deploy terror attacks against innocent Israelis. Israel's understandable reluctance to bring the fight to those facilities for far too long has resulted in Hamas becoming ever deeper entrenched within its terror nest, operating with an unacceptable degree of impunity as it launched massive attacks against the state of Israel, and it enabled Hamas to survive time and again Israel's just retaliations for strikes that the terror organization launched against our people. Now, Israel will hunt down the terrorists of Hamas wherever they may be, and Israel will destroy those terrorists, rightly so. And contrary to what many people believe, proportionality in war is not assessed based on the number of casualties absorbed on either side of a given conflict. The reality is that proportionality is determined by the strategic proportionality of the target at hand relative to the war goals of the moment. Mohammed Sinwar was an arch-terrorist who engaged in terror against Israel for decades. His elimination is highly proportionate, therefore, and the IDF will, as it has always done, have taken all reasonable measures to reduce to the lowest possible level the number of civilians killed in the course of this strike, but nobody should make any mistake about it. Sinwar's elimination is correct, appropriate, and absolutely proportionate. IDF reservists have again been drafted in their thousands, and they are currently massed at the border with the Gaza Strip right as we speak. They have returned to the fray, determined to play their role in achieving the dual war objectives, namely retrieving all of the hostages kidnapped by Hamas and destroying Hamas as the ruling power inside the Gaza Strip and a functioning terror organization. Now, there does seem to be a halting of what Prime Minister Netanyahu has described as a military operation that is designed to utterly and finally destroy Hamas. And that halting seems to be a tacit agreement to hang fire until President Trump wraps up his current tour of the Middle East. But the timing of Israel's operation inside Gaza has actually been further complicated by the welcomed and celebrated return of Edan Alexander, a soldier in the IDF's Golani Brigade who was kidnapped on October 7th and who holds American citizenship. He actually served in the IDF as a volunteer soldier from abroad, an individual known as a lone soldier by dint of the fact that his immediate family does not reside in the state of Israel. And by way of negotiations that largely sidelined Israel, Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, actually brokered the release of Edan Alexander in a move that has at once caused jubilation across Israel at the sight of the return of one of our hostages, and also concern among hostage families at the possibility that the return of the last living American citizen may result in the blunting of the ambition and focus of the Trump administration, because the question on the minds of many Israelis is wondering why it is that the Trump administration can bring home its American hostage, incidentally, without paying any discernible price for doing so, while the Israeli government has failed to do so for many, many weeks now. Israelis want to see that the Israeli government can do for our hostages what the American government did for its hostage. On the back of President Trump's whirlwind trip to the Middle East, there have been a lot of affirmations by the US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, and by members of the Netanyahu government to the idea that the relationship between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu remains very, very positive. But I have to say that in light of a number of occurrences, I think there's a very real reason for concern. Consider the fact that President Trump came to the region but did not visit the state of Israel. That is reminiscent of the first time President Barack Obama came to the Middle East and did not visit the state of Israel while making all sorts of speeches from Cairo, addressing himself, as he said, to the members of the Muslim faith throughout the globe, a completely absurd description of any audience, in my opinion. President Trump has been to the state of Israel before as president of the United States, but it's a curious consideration that he's not seen it appropriate to do so or deemed it appropriate to do so during this particular trip. So that's one reason that I believe Israelis are concerned. Another reason is that there seems to be a transactional dimension to the actions of President Donald Trump that is discomforting for Israelis. The Israel-US alliance is famously said to be predicated upon shared interests, shared values. It seems that in the Trump administration, in the context of this particular trip, it may be shared interests that are being pursued, and the administration deems its most immediate interests as being within Saudi Arabia, within Qatar, and elsewhere. And in addition to that, we are seeing the direct negotiations between the Trump administration and the Iranians in order to bring about a deal. The last time an American president sought to bring about a deal between Iran and the United States in order to avoid nuclear proliferation, it brought about a huge rift in the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and that American president. And finally, you've seen the Americans engaged in direct negotiations, sidelining Israel for the release of Edan Alexander. That is something that Israel will want to bring to heel. It will want to be engaged in the negotiations for any and all hostages, incidentally, in a leading role. It will not want to be usurped or end run by an American administration. So I think were all of those considerations to have played out with a Democratic president of the United States, either a President Joe Biden or a President Barack Obama, Prime Minister Netanyahu, looking at his history, would have been far more outspoken in his opposition to those events by this stage. He's less outspoken at this time in the context of President Donald Trump, firstly because the history of Donald Trump as president is far more favorable towards the state of Israel than was the case with President Biden or President Obama, but also because the playbook of Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking out against President Trump will not yield the positive results for Netanyahu that it yielded when he spoke out in very, very clear and strident opposition to President Biden or to President Barack Obama. It's a different man in the White House. It's a different administration with very different advisors and a very, very different agenda.